You keep calling it an economic crisis because that sounds clean, like it's weather, like it's random. But what you're really watching is a psychological strategy wearing a suit, and you are part of the fuel. In 2008, people didn't just lose money. They lost trust. They lost housing. They lost time. And the worst part is that many of them still insisted the system was basically fair, as if repeated humiliation could somehow become proof of safety. This video is not about dry numbers from a report. It's about betrayal with an address. It's about the hidden self inside financial language, inside corporate excuses, inside your own instinct to look away. And it's about what the collapse of Lehman Brothers actually did to the world and what it's teaching you right now in the year 2026. You think power looks like something dramatic. You think it wears a crown. You imagine evil as loud. But in reality, power is quiet, procedural, and psychological. It teaches people habits, the habit of buying the story, the habit of accepting inequality as normal, the habit of confusing debt with destiny. Lehman Brothers was not just a company that failed, it was a trigger, a chosen wound. And once you understand that, you stop asking, why did this happen, and start asking the only question that matters. Who benefits from my fear? Now let's go back to the morning the narrative broke. On September 15th, 2008, in the space between darkness and the first news alerts, a financial bomb went off. Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. The public story said it was a sudden shock, an unpredictable rupture, a failure of liquidity. The financial story said the numbers were complicated. The televised story said it was the market correcting itself. But the inner truth was colder than all of that. Lehman didn't simply run out of money. It collapsed under obligations it never had a fair chance to survive. The scale was obscene. Hundreds of billions in assets sitting on top of an even larger weight of liabilities. People were told that the ratio was a technicality. But to your nervous system, technicalities are just ways to avoid feeling the threat. If you can't understand the math, you can still understand the psychology. When a structure is built on leverage, it doesn't need a disaster to fall. It only needs a slight tremor, a few percentage points in funding conditions, and the structure turns from tall to fragile, from stable to instantly fatal. This is what makes the story so offensive. The collapse wasn't a random fall. It was the exposure of a mechanism that was always there. And when the mechanism was exposed, someone had to be the sacrificial animal, not because they deserved it, but because the system needed a lesson. And your job, watching from the outside, was to learn the wrong lesson. The wrong lesson was, never trust markets again. The right lesson is, never trust who profits from the panic. The hidden self loves panic, because panic gives you something to do without requiring you to change. You can scroll, you can argue, you can blame leaders, you can memorize dates. All of that burns energy while keeping the core belief intact, that you are powerless. That belief is the real debt. So let's talk about how an empire becomes untouchable, and then how it gets cut. Lehman Brothers did not start as a villain. It started as a business. That is important, because the system doesn't need monsters. It needs ordinary competence mixed with appetite. The Lehman Brothers were immigrants from Germany to the United States. They arrived in a world where cotton was real. You could touch it, you could handle it, you could sell it into demand. And in the beginning, that kind of trade has dignity. It's not abstract. It's labor and goods. Then the lesson arrives, always arrives, the one the hidden self hates. The producer is rarely the winner. The person who creates value often gets paid and replaced. The person who controls the flow of money around that value can eat everyone else's future. After the American Civil War devastated parts of the South, the Lehman story shifted. They stopped saving people and started financing outcomes. In war, in rebuilding, in capital markets, you don't just move goods, you move debts, you move risk, you package promises. And you learn that the real commodity is access to other people's need. For more than a century, Lehman survived. It survived depressions. It survived wars. It survived because it wasn't competing in only one arena. It sat near the center of the financial nervous system. In that world, survival isn't just about being smart, it's about being connected. But even an elite creature has predators. In the jungle, the animal that becomes too arrogant or too expensive eventually becomes food. So, the environment changes. The era of the 1990s arrives, and with it, a different kind of financial beast. Risk is no longer treated as something you avoid. Risk becomes something you slice, rename, securitize, and distribute. If you can spread it far enough, you can pretend it disappears. And that's where the psychological mask begins. You stop saying people will fail. You start saying models indicate spread. You stop saying loans are dangerous. You start saying credit quality. You stop saying we're betting against the poor. You start saying innovation. Then you meet the figure who symbolizes the era, the trader, the leader, the gorilla-eyed salesman of leverage. The man everyone feared because he could run the machine. He didn't just want profit. He wanted dominance of the narrative. Lehman became less like a bank and more like a vacuum. It sucked up the mess of the market, turned it into structured products, and sold the illusion of safety. It didn't create value. It created distance between responsibility and consequence. Now we have to name the three tricks that make the entire scam work. Not with fancy words, with the mechanism. First, they lure the poor with a costume of fairness. They target people who are desperate, people with no cushion, people who were already struggling before the offer arrived. Not because those people are uniquely stupid, because those people are uniquely exposed. The system calls them something that sounds clinical. No income, no job, no access. The phrase is meant to reduce humans into categories so the conscience can sleep. Then comes the pitch. Low rates at the beginning, temporary relief, easy payments for the first 2 years, the promise that the future will be better. This is the hidden self in action on a mass scale. The poor don't just want money. They want relief from shame. They want status. They want a door that doesn't slam when they apply. A house is not just an asset, it's an identity upgrade. Debt becomes a story. I'm climbing. I'm different. I'm not stuck. But the loan is designed with a trapdoor. The rate resets. The payment becomes unpayable. And when failure happens, it's framed as personal weakness, not structural predation. Second, they clean the poison with fake labels. They take messy loans, mix them with better ones, and then feed them into rating agencies that are not independent the way you were taught to believe. The rating process becomes a rubber stamp. The products are labeled safe, investment grade, stable. And suddenly the scam has permission to travel. AAA sounds like safety. It's supposed to mean low risk. But in this world, AAA can mean only one thing. The risk is being moved away from the people who created it. The risk goes to the people who don't know what they're holding. Third, they sell the illusion to everyone else. They package the debt into securities and sell them to institutions, cities, pension funds, European investors, anyone whose money can move fast. The buyers often believe they are diversifying. They believe they are professionals. They believe they are insulated. And here's the psychological disaster. Many buyers are not stupid. They are rational within the story they were given. When you believe the system is supervised, you stop questioning. When you believe ratings are trustworthy, you stop analyzing. When you believe the market corrects itself, you stop demanding accountability. People don't fail because they lack intelligence. People fail because they lack suspicion when the stakes become personal. Then the inevitable happens. The reset rates arrive. The payments jump. Households break. Foreclosures rise. The toxic bundle stops looking like gold and starts looking like mud. And what makes it especially brutal is this. The collapse doesn't end with consequences for the people who caused it. Instead, the collapse becomes the permission slip for consolidation. It becomes the moment to buy assets cheaply from everyone who panicked. That's the hidden script behind the headline. Crisis is not only destruction, it is transfer. And transfer is where the real winners appear. Now we enter the part people hate. The lie about big banks that must be saved. There was a belief that Lehman was too big to fail, even while the decision was made not to save it. That contradiction should bother you. It bothered many people. But the system's logic is not about safety. It's about leverage. If you can save one institution, you can also sacrifice one institution, depending on what political and financial goals you need to accomplish. Why save Bear Stearns earlier and then allow Lehman to fall later? Why do some get rescue and others get burial? The simplest explanation is not technical, it's strategic. Lehman was useful as a dramatic example, an official shock that could reset the public mood. It could generate maximum fear, and fear increases compliance. Fear reduces scrutiny. Fear makes lawmakers accept emergency measures without demanding full accountability. And the emergency measures were not designed to protect you. They were designed to protect the system and the people inside it. A huge bailout package passed through political channels with the story. If we don't act immediately, everything collapses. But the question remains, why did everything not collapse earlier when other institutions were in trouble? The answer is that collapsing is sometimes an instrument. Fear can be manufactured by who gets saved and who doesn't. This is where the hidden self of elite power appears. They don't just play games with money, they play games with belief. If you can control what you fear, you can control what you accept. So after Lehman's fall, the world watched the wreckage. 10,000 plus workers disappeared from the official count. Families lost homes. Millions experienced the kind of shock that changes behavior for years. Stress grew into depression. Depression grew into silence. Silence grew into resignation. Meanwhile, the real assets were being quietly gathered by others. This part feels unfair because it is. The winners bought the broken parts at discounted prices. They received enormous support from the government, not because they were uniquely virtuous, but because they were strategically aligned. They eliminated competition. Then they reported record profits. Real estate investors purchased foreclosed homes cheaply. They turned the country from homeowners into renters. I can call it economic adjustment. But if you look at it as psychology, it's a social downgrade delivered with spreadsheet language. It strips dignity. It removes stability. It makes people dependent on monthly payments that can rise forever. So, ask yourself what changed. What changed is not just balance sheets. What changed is your relationship with security. Home used to represent belonging. Now it represents risk. And once risk becomes normal, control becomes easier. Because a frightened population doesn't demand justice, it demands relief. And relief is exactly what systems offer in exchange for obedience. This is what modern finance is. Massive asset movement upward. Wealth doesn't evaporate during crises, it relocates. It relocates through rules you didn't write, through institutions you didn't supervise, through mechanisms you were discouraged from understanding. And after the relocation, the system tells you it was an accident. But it's not just the events of 2008 that matter, it's what those events taught the next generation of power. They created a precedent. If the system is threatened, public money will be used to stabilize private assets. That means the public bankroll becomes a permanent tool. Taxes, emergency spending, interest rate policy, central bank interventions, all of it becomes a floodgate. Then the debt reality spreads. Governments borrow to manage economic damage, and borrowing becomes a permanent feature of the state. Central banks maintain liquidity and manage expectations. Credit expands. Not all of it goes into productive things. Much of it goes into speculative markets, corporate consolidation, and financial engineering. Eventually, you get a world where debt is not just a personal situation, it's a societal environment. The hidden self grows up inside that environment. You start thinking debt is normal. You start thinking inequality is unavoidable. You start thinking you can't escape the system. You just have to optimize within it. But optimizing within a cage is still staying in a cage. Now I want you to notice something. This entire story is not only about finance, it's about how you become someone who can be managed. Because debt works psychologically, it makes you behave. Debt makes you accept jobs you hate. Debt makes you stay in relationships you should leave. Debt makes you tolerate bosses who disrespect you. Debt makes you postpone health. Debt makes you stop planning. Debt makes you afraid to say no. Debt is not only money owed, debt is a leash around your attention. And when attention is managed, you become predictable. This is the next evolution. The system doesn't only take your money, it tries to take your decision-making. So what happens after the Lehman lesson? The world keeps building the same structure with new material. By the time we reach 2024, 2025, and now 2026, the signals are not subtle if you stop pretending they are. The global debt level is at extreme heights. Inflation is not just an economic event, it's a redistribution mechanism. Interest rates being held high is not always purely about inflation. Sometimes it is a deliberate tightening designed to strain weaker borrowers until they collapse and their assets can be bought by stronger players. That's the bloodless version of violence. You see small businesses struggling. You see older business models becoming unprofitable. You see cash flow choke while corporate giants survive and even expand. The narrative says competition or innovation. But from a predator's view, it's attrition. It's thinning the herd. The hidden self in you hears this and tries to reduce it to personal advice. Maybe you should save more. Maybe you should budget. Maybe you should invest differently. Saving and budgeting matter. But if you treat this as only a personal game, you miss the system's violence. You miss why the ground keeps shifting under your feet. The system uses inflation to erode purchasing power while wages lag. This is not a mystery. It's a transfer tool. If prices rise faster than wages, real wages shrink, real savings shrink. The debt burden for the people who hold assets can shrink, especially when they can borrow cheaply or restructure. Then, when interest rates eventually tighten further or reverse, the weakest collapse first, the strongest buy. This is why a financial crisis feels like a storm to the public, but feels like a harvest to the elites. Now let's get to the psychological heart of it. Why do people keep believing? Because believing reduces terror. It gives you a narrative that you can control. If you can believe that things will recover and government will fix it, then you can sleep. You don't have to face the uncomfortable conclusion that power is not on your side. The hidden self avoids that conclusion because it requires action, it requires grief, it requires letting go of fantasies about fairness. But here's the harsh truth. If you want the world to be fair, you must become the kind of person who can defend yourself inside unfair structures. Fairness is not something you wait for. Fairness is something you build or extract through leverage, skills, and assets. Which brings us to the modern threat you may not be fully naming yet. Central bank digital currency is often sold as convenience and safety. It's marketed with friendly words, transparency, efficiency, reduced fraud. But convenience is not neutral. Tools always serve the motivations of their owners. If money becomes programmable, it becomes controllable. If your spending can be influenced by policy, then your freedom becomes conditional. If transactions can be restricted based on political preferences or compliance thresholds, then your life becomes trackable and steerable. You don't need a dystopian movie to understand this. You just need to understand what happens when the lever of control sits with a small group and the public is trained to accept the trade. And you're trained. You're trained by fear, by slow normalization, by the constant message that change is inevitable and you have no choice. Your choice is real. But it requires you to stop treating financial education like a hobby. You have to treat it like survival. Let's talk about what you can do when the system is designed to cut you. First, stop being the person who only owns paper. Not all paper is worthless. Cash is paper. Bonds are paper. But the point is not about the type of medium. It's about whether you own something that retains value when the narrative breaks. In a crisis, the numbers on screens can become illusions. Your app can keep showing prices even as reality changes. You can watch your wealth shrink without the ability to convert it into safety. So the hidden self needs a new habit: asset realism. Ask yourself what you truly can access, what you truly can sell, what retains value under stress, what can produce something, what can shelter you. Some people argue about gold versus land versus